Welcome to the next video in our series, Designing Sessions with Adults in Mind. In this video, we'll talk about the principles of adult learning. We'll talk about what helps adults stay focused on their learning and discussion processes and sessions. And we'll talk about things that you can do as a session presenter to help keep your participants involved and engaged from beginning to end. As a session presenter, you are going to share a learning experience with your colleagues, and you will be the person who leads that learning process during the session. So as a session presenter, it's important to understand a bit about the adult learning process, which is called andragogy. Of course, as teachers, we're familiar with pedagogy, and as session presenters, it's important to know some of the unique nuances about adult learning that are a little bit different from considerations for our students that we work with every day. In a moment, we're going to explore 7 principles of andragogy that Elena Aguilar and Laurie Cohen share in their book called The PD Book. And while all learners have some of these things in common, it's important to know that our adult learners that we work with and facilitate professional learning for have unique conditions for learning as well. Think back to some professional development sessions you've attended in the past, specifically ones that spent, let's call it the first 5 to 10 minutes going over the session agenda and introductions and those sorts of things. Do you remember that session agenda well? If you don't, it could be because of what's called the primacy-recency effect. The idea here is that information that's presented at the beginning and the end of a learning episode tend to be what we retain and remember over time, and we'll lose some things in the middle. It's interesting that the information we remember the least is in the middle, because oftentimes in professional learning, we spend the middle portion of a session covering really important content. So it's important to capitalize on the primacy-recency effect in your session design. The best way to capitalize on the primacy-recency effect and make use of those really important initial minutes of your session is to start your session with an activity first, and then introduce yourself in the session agenda next. When we involve our participants in activities that are related to the session content right off the bat, we not only give them an opportunity to engage with the topic right away and use those precious primacy moments, but we also get to establish credibility with our delegates in the room. We get a chance to share some insights, maybe a story following the activity, and then introduce ourselves in a way that makes sense with the session content. So start with an activity and then introduce yourself. Remember that when we lead our colleagues through a professional development session, part of our role is to create a sense of community for the short time that we're together. We want folks to feel comfortable to share ideas and build relationships with one another and explore the topic at hand in a way that feels safe. So when we create low-risk situations where people can learn about each other, where they can engage in productive conversation and have fun, what we're doing is building community. This is our most important job as a PD facilitator, and it helps when we engage our participants in community building activity at the beginning of our session. We are priming our participants' minds to connect with the content and to connect with each other. All right, let's talk about the principles of andragogy, or adult learning. We have included some information from a book called The PD Book, which is written by Elena Aguilar and Laurie Cohen, and they have summed up the principles of adult learning into these 7 key points. So the first thing we need to know is that adults need to feel safe to learn. When we don't feel safe, we're going to spend our cognitive energy on self-preservation. So as a session presenter, what we want to do is create an environment where our participants understand that we have their best interests at heart, and everyone's voice is welcomed and encouraged, because we know when we learn from each other, our learning experience is enriched. Adults also come to learning experience with histories. We have a lot of personal and professional experience and expertise that we bring to a PD session. And it's not uncommon for adult learners to be familiar with some of your session content or even a great deal of it. And that's actually a great thing. When we have an opportunity to make connections between what we already know and something that's new, this helps to make our learning even deeper and more permanent. So as a session facilitator, we can create an environment where we have opportunities for conversation and sharing, because we know when we tap into the expertise of our colleagues, our learning experience is that much more rich and valuable. Adults also want to know the why of a learning experience. We want to know why the content of your session is important. We want to know why we're being asked to do a particular discussion activity, for example. And when we know the why behind our learning, we're more so apt to engage with it in a fulsome way. The opposite is also true. When we don't necessarily understand the why behind what we're doing, we'll be maybe more reluctant to engage fully in the session content and activities. So sharing the why behind your topic, your session topic, sharing the why behind you're asking folks to, we'll say, get up and move for a discussion is a really important piece to engaging your participants. The next thing is about agency. As teachers and just adults in general, we are making decisions all day long. We want autonomy and some control over the way we learn in a session. Now, we don't need to make all of the decisions, to be clear, but we do crave a little bit of opportunity to make some choice. Perhaps it's choice in who I have a conversation with during a session. Perhaps it's a choice in how I, record information for an activity. Whatever it is, adults value agency. We also need practice to internalize our learning. And this is especially important when we have a concept or skill or any sort of evidence-based practice that we're going to bring into our classrooms. If we don't feel really solid with that knowledge, we might actually just avoid it or maybe misapply it in some way. So building in opportunities for adults to practice the skills and concepts that you're covering in your session is really important. It could be through a reflection activity. It could be through a discussion opportunity with feedback. It could be a scenario-based opportunity where you transfer knowledge to different situations. So on that note, adults also have a problem-centered approach to learning. If there are specific contexts where the knowledge they're learning in your session can help solve an issue or a problem of practice that they're facing, they'll be far more engaged and motivated in the to participate in the session. If we can help identify problems of practice that will be addressed in our session, that will help your participants to see the applicability and relevancy of the session content to their everyday work. Finally, adults want to learn. We have a hectic life as teachers. We have a heavy workload. We have a lot on our plate. When we come into a session, we likely have all kinds of things swirling in our minds. And in spite of all this busyness, we want to learn. And as a session facilitator, it's important for us to recognize that and assume that everyone in the room wants to learn. Everyone has the desire to engage with our session. And what we can do is create an environment where we give our colleagues a chance to slow down, take a breath, and devote an hour, let's say, to learning and conversation. Based on the principles of adult learning, one thing we know about adults is that we come to our learning with histories. One of the most important things you can do to create a safe community climate for your participants is to acknowledge the histories they bring with them. What I like to do is after I engage my participants in an activity right away to capitalize on those really important primacy moments, I will stand and acknowledge that all voices and experiences in the room are welcomed and valued. It's important for us to make space to acknowledge that, yes, colleagues, it's possible that there's some of the session content today that you might be familiar with, and you bring your experiences, stories, and reflections to our discussion today. Because of that, our session is going to be more rich. So whether the content feels new to you or whether it's a familiar reminder of things that you know through experience and study, all of your perspectives are welcome. And I think that's an important sentiment to share with your colleagues towards the beginning of a session. As the leader of a PD session, it's important to frame your moves and decisions that you make during your session with a few things in mind. Remember, we're working with adults in our session. So when we think about what we can control as the session presenter, the things we can control are the way we show up to our session. We can control our attitude and our disposition that we bring to this work. We can decide what to keep in our session and what to cut if we're running low on time. We can make adjustments to activities and content during the session to, let's say, increase the energy in the room or to give folks a moment of quiet reflection. We can also choose how we interpret what happens in the session, and we can choose how we respond to what happens as well. Now, as the session leader, we also have to think about what we can influence. Well, we can influence group dynamics in the room. We can plan activities to make sure that everyone gets a chance to participate and share ideas. We can influence the energy level of the room by adding, let's say, some energizing physical movement by getting folks up and walking around, or giving some moments of quiet personal reflection after a really boisterous activity. We can also influence how participants feel about the outcome of the session or activity with what we say after it's concluded. Now, we do also have to consider what is outside of our influence and control. As a session presenter, we are not able to influence or control how participants apply their learning. As adult learners, they have agency to decide what to do with what they take from your session. The other thing that is outside of our influence and control is what participants are going through outside of this workshop. We can never know what folks bring in with them to a session, but what we can do is focus on things we can control and things we can influence and align our approach to the principles of adult learning. Let's take some time to think a little bit more about factors that we can control and factors that we can have influence over in our professional development session. In the next segment of the video, we're going to explore some purposeful moves that you can make in designing your session and in facilitating the session on the day of that will allow the adult learners in the room to feel engaged with the session content and enjoy themselves in the process. When we're designing learning for our colleagues, and especially if it's a PD session that is on a topic we feel really passionate about or we have a really in-depth knowledge of, sometimes it's easy to get almost paralyzed by the knowledge that we have. Sometimes it's hard to find a starting point to design a professional development session when we know that this topic that we want to talk about would be best done in a full university course or even a master's degree. Remember that when we're presenting a session at a conference or a teacher's convention and we have 1 hour of time, even 2 hours of time, it's really difficult to lend an in-depth exploration to most topics in education. Instead, I'd suggest reframing your approach to your session design. Think about this as an opportunity to start a conversation about a topic or a skill or a concept or a practice that you think is important. It's possible that you may have participants in your session who know much more about this topic than you do as well, and that's a great thing. Remember that PD sessions are opportunities for us to connect our knowledge and our histories as adult learners to something new, and to connect our histories to our colleagues as well. So remember, your session is the start of a conversation, and there are many people in your session who will appreciate the opportunity to connect with the content and the topic and their colleagues in a different way. So we do know that adults appreciate agency in their learning experiences, and we also know that adults appreciate a clear structure for learning as well. So when you are planning an activity for your session, plan the instructions for your activity thoughtfully so that you're able to deliver them on the day in a way that is clear, concise, actionable by all folks in the room, and in a way that is respectful of the adults in your PD session. I would recommend avoiding any sort of structures that you would use with young students. So for example, if you would say to a group of young students, 1, 2, 3, eyes on me, and they call back to you, 1, 2, eyes on you, I would recommend avoiding structures like that to silence or call to attention the participants in your session. As teachers, some of us, find that amusing, and we participate in a way that, is, fine and fun. And others do find that patronizing. So I would avoid using any structures that you would use to call young students to attention. One of the best things that we can do for the adults in our session is to make space. It's important for us to avoid creating an agenda for a session that is just completely jam-packed with content, research, and other things where we micromanage every moment of the time that we have with our participants. It's just that pace does not allow our participants to process the content in the way that they need to. We want to give our participants opportunity to reflect and to make connections between what they already know, what they've heard from their colleagues in the room, and the new learning that they're doing. We want to make space for our participants to practice any skills and other things that we're doing if that applies to your session content. We need to make space for processing, and it's one of those things where we're going slow to go fast, if that makes sense. Give your participants an opportunity to slow down, process, reflect, or practice, and they'll take more away from your session when they walk out the door. As a session presenter, it is important to be mindful of the words that we choose to discuss our session content. And I'd like to specifically speak about intentional and thoughtful pronoun usage. So when we're speaking to the content of our session and we choose pronouns, they can convey, whether we intend for them to or whether we don't intend for them to, they can convey a message. So when we choose the words we or us, these words convey a sense of collective responsibility. We use we or us when we want to communicate that everyone in the room, the session presenter, all the delegates or participants, we're all involved in this work together. We or us in a session would sound something like this. All right, everybody, in this activity, we're going to explore the 7 principles of andragogy. So I've used the we pronoun to indicate that, hey, we're all going to be involved in this discussion. We're all going to be exploring this work together. You might also choose to use you and your pronouns. You and your can convey that your participants have ownership over something in particular. And this can be helpful in a session, but it can also be problematic depending on the way you use it. You and your creates a separation between you, the session presenter, and your participants. So when you're doing an activity, for example, were you to say, all right, folks, in this next activity, you will be exploring the 7 principles of andragogy. You've essentially indicated that your participants will be doing the activity and you will be a passive observer, right? So when you're using you and your pronouns, be very cautious and mindful of the impact and the separation it can create between you and your participants. Another pronoun set to be mindful of in session presentation is the they, them. They and them can convey a sense of division between those who are in the room and another group outside of the room. And whether you intend to do so or not, a they, them pronoun can unintentionally other those to whom you're referring. It's, for example, if you were presenting a session to a group of teachers and you said they to refer to school leaders, you're intentionally or unintentionally creating a division between those two groups. So it's important to be mindful and very careful when we use the they, them pronoun in our session content. So we can avoid problematic pronoun usage by choosing neutral alternatives when we have a chance to do so. So an example of a neutral alternative would be to use the word the instead of a pronoun. So instead of saying, in this next activity, you will be doing a partnered discussion, I might say something like, all right, folks, the next activity will be a partnered discussion. You can also use or substitute certain phrases. So instead of saying phrases like your work with students, we can say the work instead, which is a little bit more neutral and reduces the opportunity for a miscommunication. When you're asking participants to engage in a discussion with one another, whether it's a small group discussion or a partner discussion, one thing you can do to help participants feel more comfortable is to use something called a third point. A third point is an object that is essentially intended to be the focus of attention during a discussion. We can use a third point like a handout, for example. Maybe it's a small handout that has an excerpt from an article. It could be an image or a graph that's presented on the screen. It could be a card sort activity with cards that participants work with. It could be a card with some data to discuss. Whatever that object is, the intention of it is that it becomes the focus of attention for the two people who are talking with one another. So instead of having to make constant eye contact with one another and focus on kind of the personal part of the discussion, when we add a third point, this allows something for people to gesture to. They can point to the data or the object. They can look at the screen and refer to the image or the graph that's there. It gives folks an opportunity to focus on the topic at hand, and it depersonalizes the conversation a little bit. So it's less about you and me and whether or not we agree or disagree, and it's more about the data or the third point and our thoughts about that piece. When we talked about the principles of adult learning earlier, we talked about adults wanting agency in their learning. And participant guides and note-taking in a session is a really important consideration in this. Now, adults generally like to have something to engage with in their learning. Having some paper, handouts and things like that can be a useful supplementary piece to your session. And if you're thinking about participants and their note-taking, it's important to allow folks to have agency in the way that they engage with note-taking activities. Certainly adults love to draw, love to sketch note, love to write bullet point lists and have notes all over the place. We all have our preferred method. So using a placemat or a graphic organizer that gives space for adults to make a decision about how they'd like to interact with the content is a great approach to allow your participants some agency.